Last episode, we saw Jesus captured. He willingly went with the religious leaders so that we could be saved. In this episode, we're looking at an unjust trial that they gave to Jesus. How Jesus was charged with crimes that he didn't commit so that ultimately he could save us. Stick around to find out more. Recorded at the Running H Studio, you're listening to Venture Tabernacle. It's like venture capital, except that the investment is made in your soul. This is where America hangs out to talk about anything and everything from a biblical perspective. I'm your host, Ty Hervey. Join me as we learn to view the world through the objective lens of the Bible. Hey folks, welcome back for another episode of the Sunday Sermon on the Venture Tabernacle podcast, where we are going through the gospel according to Mark, verse by verse and story by story. Our text for today is Mark chapter 14, verse 53 through 65. I'll read it for you. It says, "And they led Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes came together, and Peter had followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. And he was sitting with the guards and warming himself at the fire. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. For many bore false witness against him, but their testimony did not agree. And some stood up and bore false witness against him, saying, 'We heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands.' Yet even about this, their testimony did not agree. And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, 'Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?' But he remained silent and made no answer. Again the high priest asked him, 'Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?' And Jesus said, 'I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven.' And the high priest tore his garments and said, 'What further witness do we need? You've heard his blasphemy. What is your decision?' And they all condemned him as deserving death. And some began to spit on him and cover his face to strike him, saying to him, 'Prophesy.' And the guards received him with blows." So Jesus has just been captured, and it is in the early hours of the morning. Think around 2 a.m. or so. If you missed the capture of Jesus, go back and listen to the last episode. And he is brought before this fake trial with fake witnesses and fake charges. And what happens to Jesus during this is one of the most unjust trials in all of history. Everything about how they did this trial was illegal, rigged against Jesus, and immoral. Which is ironic at the highest level because one of the core beliefs of the Jews was a fair judicial system. It had actually been built into their society for thousands of years, ever since the time of Moses. One of the laws created during that time was this. It says in Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 18 through 20, he says, "You shall appoint judges and officers in all your towns that the Lord your God is giving you, according to your tribes, and they shall judge the people with righteous judgment." Key word there. "You shall not pervert justice. You shall not show partiality, and you shall not accept a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and subverts the cause of the righteous. Justice, and only justice, you shall follow, that you may live and inherit the land that the Lord your God is giving you." I want you to see this. Justice was a central theme in the lives of the Jewish people. It was actually one of the things that was supposed to set them apart from the rest of the world, because at the time, the justice systems of many countries looked like the people in power doing whatever they wanted with no consequences. It was the definition of the good old boy system. You look at me funny, if it makes me mad, well, I'm going to send you to prison for the rest of your life. I don't need a good reason. And in this way, Israel was supposed to represent who God is to the world around them, because God is a perfectly just God. That means everything he does is fair and equal, and the old saying that the ground is level at the foot of the cross is so true. So for this trial to have happened the way that it did went against the core of who the Jews were supposed to be. And as we go through our text today, the first law that they broke in this fake trial was that it was at night. They immediately took Jesus after they captured him. According to the Jewish law in the Mishnah, that's the extra laws that the Jews made for themselves outside of the Bible, any capital trial could not happen at night. They had to be done during the day so that no one could have a secret trial while people were sleeping. They also couldn't do trials during special feasts or festivals, and so that means with it being time for the Passover celebration, they legally should have waited until at least Sunday, 3 days later, to hold the trial. But they pushed this trial through in the dead of night because they weren't seeking justice. They were being led by Satan to seek the death of Jesus. The second thing they did in this trial that broke the law was the use of false witnesses. They wanted so badly to have something to accuse Jesus of that they were willing to hire people to lie about Jesus. And what we see here is that Jesus lived such a pure and upright life that they didn't have any real testimony about anything he ever did wrong. And that's actually what Peter reminded us to do in 1 Peter 3:16. He said, having a good conscience so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. May we each live lives like that so that people will see Jesus living in us. And the people holding the trial were put to shame that night. They had nothing to bring against Jesus, so they had to make up charges. And by the way, they also broke another law in bringing false witnesses in their court system. If you lied about what someone did, you would be held responsible for the same level of punishment that crime would get. So if I lied in court saying that you did something that deserved the death penalty, and it was found out that I lied about that, I would actually get the death penalty. It was honestly a wonderful system that kept the courts and witnesses honest because their lives were tied to what they said in court. Nowadays, people can accuse someone of anything they want with almost no consequences if it's found out that they're lying. This wasn't the case for them, and each of the false witnesses that came against Jesus should have also been put to death if they were following the law. But of course, they weren't. This was, after all, one of the most unjust trials in all of history. But even with the help of liars, they couldn't get a conviction of Jesus. The stories had to match up, and none of them did. The high priest asked Jesus if he wanted to defend himself, and Jesus was silent. Jesus had no need to defend himself. He hadn't done anything wrong. And he also knew that the outcome of this trial had already been decided against him before it ever began. They were just looking for him to incriminate himself. And so the high priest asked Jesus a direct question meant to trap him. In verse 61 and 62, it says, "But he remained silent and made no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, 'Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?' Jesus said, 'I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven.'" And this was all they needed. It was their smoking gun because in Jesus' answer, he made himself equal with God. The seat at the right hand of God is reserved for the Messiah only. What Jesus essentially said to the crowd is that he is God. And they lost their minds. To them, they had just witnessed the greatest sin that someone could commit. To claim to be God when you're not is the worst thing that you could possibly do. And of course, we know that Jesus' claim was actually true, but their wickedness had blinded their eyes to the truth that was staring them in the face. And hearing what Jesus said, the court condemned Jesus to death. And they proceeded to beat Jesus. They covered his face and hit him, and they mocked him and told him if he was so powerful to tell them who it was who was hitting him. Now, I've often said that it takes a coward to fight in a crowd. Real men fight one-on-one when the time for that comes, and these men were even worse. They beat Jesus when he was tied up and defenseless. Cowards of the worst type. Now, what I want you to see from our text today is the difference between Jesus and the people who put him on trial. Jesus in the entire ordeal was calm, cool, and collected. The religious leaders were angry, illogical, and dishonest. At every step in the process, Jesus was honest and humble. The men trying him were liars and full of pride. Jesus had broken no laws, yet he was condemned to death. The men trying him broke multiple laws, yet walked free. Yet in spite of how perfect Jesus was and that he did nothing wrong, he was still sentenced to death. And he willingly went on our behalf and died the death each of us deserve. The world we live in is full of evil, full of people who will treat you the same way they treated Jesus. It's up to us to live a life that honors God every day, so that when they treat us unjustly, we can have no reason to be ashamed because we did what was right in God's eyes. Every sin has to be paid for, and God says that vengeance belongs to him. At the end of time, God is going to make everything right and just. The question we should be asking ourselves is, are we ready for that?